can't refers to a physical impossibility. I can't jump out of the third floor window and survive. But everything else is a choice. So somebody says, well, I can't raise this with my spouse. No, we say, I choose not to raise this with my spouse. Now, that may be a wise choice. But what I would hope the listener would realize is that all of our behavior is a choice, and to take responsibility for our choice.
Okay, welcome back to the Become Your Own Therapist podcast, the podcast where I try to put myself out of a job as a clinical psychologist. Today we have David Bradford on the podcast. He is the Eugene O'Kelly II Emeritus Senior Lecturer in Leadership at the Graduate School of Business, Stanford University. He received his BA in Psychology from Oberlin College in 1960 and PhD in Social Psychology from the University of Michigan in 1966. After graduation, he was Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison from 1966 to 1969. In 1969, he came to the Stanford University to join the Graduate School of Business in order to develop what has become the landmark course in the MBA program, Interpersonal Dynamic, something that the students call touchy-feely. He was the founder and first director of the Management and Organizational Behavior Teaching Society that focuses on innovative approaches to experiential learning. He was also the first editor of their journal. His research and consulting has focused on the question of what does it take for individuals and teams to achieve high performance. This has led to developing new approaches to leadership that release the potential within organizations. He's authored many articles and books, and he has lectured at and consulted for a range of organizations in the private sector, as well as for many not-for-profit organizations. David, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Glad to be here. Looking forward to this.
Okay, great. So we sort of had a preliminary plan, which was to discuss relationships, why they're important in our lives, and then sort of move on to this great book that you've co-authored, Connect. And the value there in building exceptional relationships. So yeah, maybe we can start with what is the importance of relationships, and I'm also curious about what got you interested in that question.
Well, as you said, my degree is in social psychology with a focus on interpersonal behavior, and also I had acquired a technology which is not therapeutic, but is somewhat similar to group therapy. It's called training groups, in which small groups of people sit down and look at their relationship and learn from each other. So it's very experiential and very personal and very powerful. So one of the things that we know is that strong relationships are a sign, not a sign, but also a cause of physical and mental health. People who have strong relationships live longer, are less likely to be depressed, are less likely to have other sort of ailments. So relationships are very important. We are social animals. We need other people. So let me spell out why we need people. For one thing, if we have a strong, open relationship with a few other people, we tend to be accepted. And we tend to be accepted for who we are, not for who we pretend to be. And even better, I can start to share some parts of myself that I'm not particularly proud about or feel good about. And to hear that you still want to be connected with me doesn't make them go away, but puts them into their right size rather than my building them into being much larger. So acceptance is very important. Also, if we have a more open relationship, I'm more likely to share my concerns. So I bring them out of the darkness, and in sharing them, they often shrink a little bit in size. But also in sharing them, I often get insights as to what is going on. So the very process of sharing, and I'm sure, Naveen, you have seen this in therapy, that the patient sometimes just in talking about it gets insights or gets a greater understanding, that we can do this when we share that with others. Finally, other people can help us work this through. And I can come to that later because others can do things that help or not so helpful, and we ought to look at that. But if we have these relationships, we're more likely to be able to work out our problems and grow in the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've made a very convincing argument for the importance of relationships, and there seems to be there seems to be something there about relationships providing a context for other things to grow, like the self-awareness and just personal development as well. So it seems, and I've actually looked at the research recently on loneliness and how that's having a more detrimental effect on our health than actually many physical conditions. I'm not too sure if you're familiar with that.
Yes, I am. Yes, the Attorney General's report that that he saw it as in the United States a greater cause problems in the opiate crisis or addiction or obesity,
Yes.
and that when we're alone, it's sort of like problems in our minds become much more magnified. And when we're alone, we feel even more alone, and we feel somehow not quite like other people. And if we can share and others can share, we see that we're often in many ways very similar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's almost healing. It sounds very healing, and it also, yeah. I guess that's what sort of got me wondering about what kinds of relationships you need for that sort of healing context. Does it make a difference just to have people around? Like lots of people in the background, or is it a specific kind of relationship that allows for the perceived loneliness to be eased?
I think it's a special kind. I don't know about you, but when I'm at a party and I don't know anybody, I feel very, very alone, even though there may be scores of people around me, particularly if they seem to be interacting with each other and I'm not connected. So I think that's why we call our book Connect, that it's really having a relationship where I am connecting with each other on a much more personal level. Yes, we have superficial relationships. They're part of our life, but that's not really what's important. So in the research we've done on relationships, we find there are 6 core dimensions, and that can help us understand how to build relationships and what to work on. The first one is, to what extent can I be myself and not have to present an image? You'll not know everything about me, but the more that I can share about me, the more I am fuller in our interaction. Second, can I build conditions where you can also be more yourself? So I can see that we are in many ways similar. And even if we're on different points on a dimension, you're concerned about some things that I'm not concerned about, and vice versa. I see that you have concerns as well as I do. The third thing that's really important is, can we share that and it won't be used against us? And I'm sure you've found this in therapy. I know when I've been in therapy and found it very helpful, it's a whole notion, if I tell my therapist this, will he or she still accept me and not, in a sense, chide me? And it's that notion that I can be myself and still be accepted. Related is a fourth one of, can we be honest with each other so that you know that what I say is what I mean and you don't have to read between the lines? Any relationship is going to have disagreements and conflicts. Can we raise them and resolve them in a way that builds it? And finally, are each of us committed to the other's growth and development? Now, these are high standards. We argue that if you have 3 or 4 relationships that are high on these 6 dimensions, you're quite fortunate. But you can still have strong relationships, work relationships, friendships that aren't at the extreme of these 6, but are pretty high in them. And I think that's a goal that I would have. And the nice thing about these 6 is they often give us a clue as to what to work on. So am I withholding important information from you? That would give me a clue as to what I could do. Or are there parts of you that I don't know that I'd like to know? Are there disagreements we have shoved under the rug that we ought to bring out and work on so we can become closer? So it gives us an idea of what we can work on to strengthen. And we see relationships on a continuum. Many are sort of surfacey, but others are closer. Others are more intimate, more personal. And there are, as we say, a few that are exceptional, and we can build any of our relationships to move it slightly further along that continuum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what I really appreciated about the book is that all the dimensions that you outline are dimensions on which the scale can be shifted, like the needle can be dialed in some way.
Yes. And you don't have to take it to the upper end to make it better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very important to just bypass that maybe idealistic sort of ambition, or that maybe that perfectionism that comes out in my relationships have to be at that extreme
Yes.
end.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not true.
And I guess you have lots of experience in helping people practically just shift those dials just slightly up on certain dimensions and in specific relationships.
Yes. And so we teach this course that you mentioned, and students take the risk, and it is a risk, to be more themselves, to be willing to disagree without attacking the other, to ask for help and to know how to give help. And these are a set of competencies all of us can learn. They're not so esoteric that you need a degree to do it, but any of us can learn it. And in our book, Connect, we give suggestions for how you can acquire these and how you can apply them to different relationships that you have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm curious about the course because I think I read somewhere that it's one of the most popular electives or something along those lines. That it's well sought after.
Yes, it's an elective. 85% of our MBAs sign up for the course. We teach 12 sections, so it's the most popular course and most sought after. Well, what's also rewarding about it is when alumni get together, it's the one course they talk about. And we get emails or get calls, and a person 10, 15, 20 years out says, I'm still using this material. In fact, we did a small poll at a reunion where we had alumni from up to 25 years ago. And we asked the group, to what extent are you still using this material? And 75% said, on a sort of a 5-point scale, said somewhat to every day. And that's very rewarding. So what we learn is we learn a set of competencies for how we can be more open, get help, raise difficulties, and strengthen the connections we want.
Yeah, that's very powerful. I'd love to get into the content of how to turn up these dials, but before I do, I just want to ask why you think it's been so impactful and why it's so sought after, this content. What are people hungry for here?
I think it's back to the point you made about loneliness. You know, we may have Facebook, we may have Twitter, we may have a couple hundred people, 400, 500,000 on our Facebook, but those really aren't connections. That's just sharing some information or learning some information. And I think also, so often we think that in order to be influential, accepted, leader-like, whatever you want, I have to be something other than myself. And one of the very rewarding parts of this course is as students learn to be more themselves, they see that they're more accepted, more themselves, including sharing things that they may not feel good about, but they become more human. And I think it's the humanness that we want to connect with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's even knowing that fact, and even knowing how much experience you have with this and anecdotal evidence, there's still that fear that arises just thinking about that, like being yourself in the social space. I imagine that other people probably also feel that way. There's some sort of anxiety or fear there looming that's saying, show a bit of this, but not that, and maybe some of it is appropriate, but is that something you've encountered a lot, that resistance to being, authentic?
Yeah, because it's always a risk. And you're absolutely right. We're not saying you share everything. I mean, that's a sign of real mental illness if you just walk down the street sharing everything. We have to be judicious. It depends on the depth of the existing relationships, on the setting, on what we share. And we've all had experience where we've shared too much. I remember in class, I was trying to demonstrate the importance of asking for help. And as I just mentioned, I've been in therapy, so I thought I'd share that. And I said, I've found therapy being very helpful. And a student afterwards came up to me and said, I respect you less knowing that. He said, I think everybody ought to solve their own problems. Well, that hurt a little bit. One likes to be accepted. But that was his values. They weren't my values. So in that case, sharing that didn't build the relationship. Hopefully, as the class went on, I think it was true, he got to know me in other ways and acceptance went up somewhat. But we've all experienced where we've shared stuff and it's been used against us. And so we are careful. Mark Twain, the American author, had a saying. He said, a cat doesn't sit on a hot stove twice, but it doesn't sit on a cold stove either. And we tend to remember the times in which we were burnt by sharing something. And we're not aware of the times in what we lost by not sharing. So we're burnt by sharing something, we say, well, never again. Well, is there something we could learn about why it wasn't appropriate then without it shutting us down? So it is a risk. So if I raise a disagreement with you, maybe it'll blow up and maybe it'll hurt our relationship. And we've all seen that. I mean, in America, 40% of marriages end in divorce. That something gets shared or there's an explosion. And so I don't want to dismiss that it's a risk, but we tend to see the cost of taking action and not being aware of the cost of inaction.
So once you have been judicious and you've assessed the situation, the risks, and it seems worthwhile being introducing more of yourself into that space, and I correct me if I'm wrong, that's the first principle there, right? Or
right, correct.
Okay. So if we get started on this list, then what usually goes on in the course to help people start to introduce these parts of themselves?
Well, I think what's really important in having you know me is not just facts about me. I've been married for 55 years. Well, that's sort of interesting. I have 2 kids, yeah, and some grandkids. But what's really interesting for you to know me are my emotions, my feelings, what I hope, what I'm concerned about, what I'm worried about. So, for example, I'm starting to have trouble with my eyesight, and that's really upsetting for me because I now can't read the newspaper, and I thank goodness for computers where I can enlarge it. Well, I'm worried about that. I'm worried about the future. So sharing feelings is really important. But too often we've been trained that feelings are not appropriate, that we shouldn't share them. So I think that what happens is in these groups, when I am leading them, a frequent comment that I'll make to a student is, say, and what are you feeling? And they'll share something, and in sharing the feeling, they become more known. So that's a very important lesson. I think the other thing they learn, it's not just what I need to do so I can get help from my friends, but there's also things the other person can do that helps or doesn't help. So, for example, we think that advice is useful. Well, it turns out it's not. Advice is rarely useful. I think lay people think that the important thing in therapy is you'll make some wise pronouncement that'll clarify things. I would guess that's rarely true. What you do is you build conditions where the client can understand themselves better. And you're likely, rather than this wise insight, you're likely, I'm guessing, Maureen, that you're going to say, well, why is that a concern for you? What are you concerned about? What could happen if you did that? So we talk in the book about asking open-ended questions, not leading questions, not saying, have you tried X? But saying, well, what have you tried? What are you worried about? What would happen if you did that? What's the downside? What do you hope to achieve? These help that the other person explore in greater detail. The other thing that's not helpful is false reassurance, saying to somebody, oh, that's not really a problem. Well, if the person feels it is a problem, it is a problem for them. And it's the power of empathy. And empathy is different than sympathy, as you know. Sympathy is tied in with pity, and we don't like to be pitied. Empathy is, can I understand you? So if somebody raises an issue, and let's assume we don't think it's the biggest thing in the world, can we realize it's big for that person? Can we say, you really seem disturbed about that? And I can understand. If I had those feelings, I'd feel disturbed too. Then the person feels accepted and can explore further. I may want to say, gee, I wouldn't be as disturbed about that, but I really hear you are. Can you tell me what's so bothering about that so that I can understand you better? So advice tends to be telling the other what I would do, but that's what I would do. It may not fit you. And reassurance, it doesn't last very long. But really understand the other, being empathic, helping them explore. That's what's most helpful. And lay people can do that. And in this course, people learn how to do that. You don't need to be a clinical psychologist. That's helpful because you have been trained to do this very well. But any one of us can be empathic, can help the other person express themselves more fully. And that's what's really helpful.
Yeah, and again, I really appreciate the fact that principles that we can all apply to our own lives and that would make our would improve our relationships, that those principles are shared, through the course. I mean, people are churned, in and out of this course on an annual basis, and they're getting skills that they're taking home and actually applying, and it's there's a ripple that isn't confined just to the therapist's office.
That's correct.
In some way.
That's correct.
So,
and an important dimension in how we can help other people is inquiry. An inquiry is not being prosecuting attorney and saying, "Oh, why haven't you done this? And why haven't you done that?" Those are close-end questions. But inquiry is really trying to understand the other person. And so if somebody is upset at us, can we, rather than defending ourselves, can we try to understand, what have I done? What's going on? Can you tell me more about what's the behavior that I've done that's gotten you bothered? And that can open up conversations. Now, here is where the paradox is. The more we're accepted, the more we're willing to ask those questions and not have to be defensive. And the more we can not be defensive, the more we're accepted.
Yeah.
So it's a iterative process, a learning process. And yes, if somebody is mad at me, I immediately want to be defensive, but can I lay down some of that armor, that false defensive armor, and get into inquiry to say, well, what have I done? I think what is central to all this is it's our behavior that gets us into trouble, not our intentions. You probably have a similar phrase, but in the States, there's a phrase, the road to hell is lined with good intentions. It's my actions. And usually good intentions. It's not I'm a bad person. I have good intentions. But how I go about it doesn't work for the two of us. And that's what I need to learn.
Yeah, that is, it's powerful how you linked it to that saying of the road to hell being paved with good intentions, because it really gets us thinking about the consequences of our actual behavior, rather than just what our intent or motive was in our mind. It's quite pragmatic.
Yes. And it's also a way to raise issues that minimize defensiveness. May not remove defensiveness, but minimize enough so we can continue. So one of the problems is if another person bothers me, I have a tendency, all of us have a tendency, to make up stories about why they're doing that. Well, we use an analogy of a tennis net, and we say there's a tennis net between your intentions, your motives, and your behavior. And if I stick with the behavior and the impact on me, it's easier to raise in a way that you can hear. But as we can't play in tennis in the other person's backcourt, we so often in interpersonal relations go to the other person's backcourt. We go over the net and we start to make assumptions and attributions about your motives. So think about it. We say to somebody, well, you just want to dominate. You just always want to win every argument. You just want to show how smart you are. Well, I'm over the net. I don't know what you want. That's a story I'm making up. No wonder you get defensive, because I'm really, this is not how you see yourself, so you want to explain yourself. If I stick with behavior and the effect on me, it's less likely to cause problems. So let me make this up, because this hasn't occurred in our conversation. But if I say, Naveen, when you interrupt me, I feel put down. I feel ignored. That's likely to create less defensiveness. Now, you can't say, no, you don't. You're over my net. Hopefully, you'll say, well, that's not what I want to do. What am I doing? And again, we focus on behavior, not on your motives, on your behavior. And we could also explore what it is about me that's so bothered by that. So let me actually use this behavior and talk about a real incident. Carol, my co-author, and I interrupt each other all the time. We see it as a sign of engagement, and we that's fine with us. I had a colleague, Daniel. I'll never forget the time I said something, and he frowned, and I said, "What's going on?" He said, "You interrupted me." I said, "So?" He said, "That's inconsiderate." And I went, wow. Now, the question is interrupt good or bad? It's a useless statement. It's good with Carol because she sees it as a sign of being engaged. It's bad with Daniel because he sees it as being inconsiderate. Now, once that got on the table, I could say, wow, it's not my intention. But I see that my interrupting really bothers you. So I'll tell you what, I'll really work hard not to interrupt. But I know I'm going to make a mistake. If I work hard at that, will you give me some forgiveness when I fail? He said, yes. And we now could have a relationship and we could know each other better. And we could also feel better about each other because we had resolved this issue. So that's the other interesting part. If you're able to raise, we call it pinches or disagreements in a way that can be resolved, it actually can build a relationship, not damage it. And we talk about how to do that in the book, about how you can raise this by staying on your side of the net, sticking with what you know, and not attacking the other by making assumptions about their motives and intentions.
And something that comes to mind is that, well, firstly, I'm definitely guilty of this, and I know many people who I sometimes get into arguments with, and we go into each other's nets. We're almost like we've swapped sides on the tennis court, and we prefer to play in the opposing side. I see how there could be so much value in just sticking with the observed behaviors and just with your own experience. It feels like you could stay with the facts of the case almost.
Yes, and part of the facts are your feelings.
Yes.
Those are facts. So we don't have to defend our feelings. If I have a feeling, I have a feeling. That's a fact. Now, why I feel that way is something for me to think about. I don't know why Daniel feels that way, but he does. And I need to take account of that. But by the way, when you said you're over the net, all of us are over the net. and it's not something wrong, because as human beings, we try to understand the world. And you do something that bothers me, it's natural I'm going to try and figure out what it is. Where we get into a problem is that we think our assumptions are true. So let me tell a story. My cousin, who I like very dearly, who actually lives in England, I was on the phone with her a couple weeks ago, and she was talking about a tiff she had with a good friend of hers. And as my cousin Sarah was going on, she was saying, well, I think I know why Natalie is mad at me. Here she's starting to make up a story. I think it's because she's a bit envious of me. And I said, well, Sarah, and as Sarah went on, she became more and more certain about her story. And I said, well, Sarah, you're making that up. You don't know that. Oh, I'm pretty sure I know. Now that's where we get into trouble, where we think we know, that we make up a story as human. But could she have said, I'm making up this story. I wonder if I can find out why Natalie does that, because I basically don't know. But we move into certainty, and that's where we get into trouble.
Yeah, and when you said we're all in each other's nets, it made me think about the fact that we were somewhat wired to almost infer other people's mental states. I thought of theory of mind and empathy and mirror neurons and the infant and caregiver relationship, and yeah, it made me think, oh yes, it's almost like doing this is almost having to override an initial urge to just assume. Yeah.
Well, I think that what urges that we not stop doing that, because you're right, I think it's hardwired, but that we realize it's our story. And that's the choice point. I can either lock into that and make it certain, or I can start to get into inquiry, and I can start to realize, I don't know. How can I find out?
Yeah. That seems like it will provide a lot more flexibility in responding and in creating a relationship that works.
Yes, and you see, if you do something that bothers me, and I catch myself against this story, and I get into wanting to understand what goes on, several things happen. I may learn something about myself. So you say, well, David, the reason why I'm upset is because when you do X, this is what it does to me. I can start to reflect, I wonder why I do X. Because maybe I do it with others. That's one outcome. Another outcome is my wanting to understand you is a form of connection in its own way. It's sort of implied, well, you're a person I want to understand. And I want to understand because of our relationship. The third outcome is that I might learn something about myself. You may feel that I'm wanting to understand you, and that helps the relationship. But in resolving it, we feel better about each other. So rather than seeing disagreements as something to avoid, see them as a sign that something needs to be worked on. And if my objective is a better, deeper relationship, maybe I can use this to deepen it. And one of the ways to deepen it is to say, what is just going on doesn't help our relationship, and I want it to be better. What can we do?
And that's not just a productive way to reframe conflict, but that's actually the case, right? That you actually do grow from resolving those conflicts.
So we use an analogy around conflict. Let's assume you're driving to work, and the car, the wheel feels a little loose, and there's a thumping in the motor. You don't start to say, bad car, and you don't ignore it. You say to yourself, hopefully, hey, I got to get this fixed. Because if I don't get this fixed, next week, I won't be able to get to the office. So we see that as a sign that something needs to be worked on. And maybe we could do the same thing with some interpersonal pinches rather than trying to ignore it or shove it under the table. So let me give you a way we think about this. This is not to say that you raise every little annoyance. I mean, life is short. We have to judge, is this important enough? But too often we say it's not worth it because we know that it's a risk. It may lead to a opening up issues that we are worried about.
Mm.
So we say it's not worth it. So we urge you to change the pronoun and say, rather than it's not worth it, you're not worth it. I'm not worth it. The relationship isn't worth it. And if you phrase it that way, you may say, it is worth it. Because if you do those three things and you still conclude the relationship isn't worth it, then let it pass. But we often then realize, no, it is worth it. It's worth the risk of raising this because there could be even greater benefits on the other side.
Yes. So what would you say to those people who they have a relationship with a family member or maybe with a romantic partner, and there is constant bickering? I think I forgot her name, but she's a famous relationship psychologist, and she talks about low-level chronic warfare, low-intensity chronic warfare, and it's the dishes, and then it's the rubbish, and then it's even there are many things, but each little thing feels big to each of the parties involved. I know some therapists who would try to find some sort of underlying issue or some theme that's been fought over. How would you address that from the perspective of your work?
Well, I think there's two issues there. So let me separate it. One is many issues are symbolic. So let me tell a real story.
Okay.
Some time ago, I was making a cup of coffee in the kitchen. Eva had just cleaned up. My wife had just cleaned up. And I put the spoon on the counter, and she got mad at me. And my first tendency was to say, it's only a spoon. What's the big issue around this? And I could have walked out and said, why don't you deal with big issues? Or I could have gotten mad at her. Fortunately, I caught myself. That was my first tendency. First to say, well, what's the issue? She said, I just cleaned up. And I said, well, yeah, but this just takes a swipe of the rag and clean up again. And as we unpacked it, what it stood for was the fact that she felt unappreciated, that I was treating her like the scullery maid. And sort of cavalierly, after she'd done all this work, making a mess. So the issue wasn't a spoon. The issue was my taking her for granted. And then we could look at that and say, are there other ways each of us don't take each other, well, each of us do take each other for granted that we don't want to? So the spoon wasn't a spoon. And so these small issues may stand for. And if we can stop for a moment and say, is there something else going on? So that's one level. The other thing you talked about is constant bickering. And I know a couple where, particularly when they've had a little alcohol, they tend to get into this bickering. I think once the alcohol is passed, I'm not sure I would do it in the middle of having had too much to drink. Could you come back and another time and say, something's going on that's getting in the way of the relationship I want, and my guess is you want, and point out the behavior. We tend to get into this sort of bickering. What's going on? And my guess is the bickering, to use the previous analogy of the car, the bickering is knocking in the engine. Yes, I can still drive the car, but it's knocking. And can I say, that's a sign of something deeper. It's not the knock, the bang in the engine that's worrisome. It's something is going on. And can we find a time? Now, this is risky because if I say, what's going on? It's likely that it's going to open up all the grievances the other person has. And that's going to open up all the grievances I have. Well, that could lead to a pretty messy situation. That may occur. But the important thing is once, even if that occurs, that we not walk away, that we not shove it back under the rug, that we instead say, we have a whole list of things we've been sitting on that get triggered by these small things. What can we do about it? And it may be that the thing we ought to do is to get some counseling. Or it may be that we can start to, as I said before, unpack this and say, what's behind this? Well, what's behind it is we don't really express our love as often as we used to. And that's what's behind it. Or that we feel used by the other person, or a dozen other things. But could we set aside and say, this isn't working for us, and not leaving it and not separating, but say, can we work better? So constant bickering is a sign that there's some knocking in the engine. And I may need to take it to the repair shop, i.e. get some counseling. Or it may be something, if I look under the hood, I can start to see what it is. And both of us can start to work on it. But the worst thing probably to do is just to ignore it. And the knocking gets worse and worse. And to continue the analogy, the engine burns out and the marriage burns out. And some marriages end, but many don't have to end if we would have caught it earlier.
Yeah, that's analogy is very useful because it's saying to me, you don't have to get into the content of all the bickering that's going on, or you don't have to get into the, how important is it that a little spoon, a little coffee from a spoon is on a counter. You don't have to get into the content there. You can actually just look under the hood, just take a pause and see what's going on. It almost feels like the imagery that comes to mind is plucking the leaves off a branch, or just snipping the one branch, so I really appreciate the. I think this deals with a lot of I think it was Principle 5, dealing with the conflict productively. I think is the term in the book, and I just wanted to check if you had anything to add onto that, because I wanted to ask you about Principle 4 as well.
Okay, the only thing I would add to it is to say, again, this is not easy. This may sound easy. It's not easy. I want to honor that. Second, that it can get messy. So I say, well, I'm bothered about this. And Eva says, well, I'm bothered about that. And then I say, and I'm bothered about this. And it can easily escalate, and it may escalate. But can we at some point say, okay, let's stop this mutual accusation, this blame game. The blame game really works. It surfaces these going, and then can we step back and say, let's stop blaming each other and let's see what's going on. So this is not clean. This is not easy. The whole notion is, can we stick with it? And can each party at some point stop and say, what's going on for me? Why am I so bothered? What is it I need? Because it's not that I know what you need, but I should try to understand, what is it I need? What's going on for me? And if I can share that and be vulnerable, it often breaks a logjam. It often de-escalates. and the other person can see that I'm hurting. And I'm assuming they basically don't want to hurt me. And then they may say, well, Chair, well, this is what's going on for me. And then we can get some work done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it opens the space for something new, not just the same old pattern that you've been stuck in. And yeah, I think I like that analogy of the log jam. I think that works quite well here. And the thing I wanted to ask you about Principle 4 was I've noticed a lot of clients, well, let me just say Principle 4 being honest. Can I be honest in this relationship? I've noticed lots of my clients and, just in my own life as well, that being honest, there are lots of blocks to that honesty. And I was curious about, having helped so many people with these interpersonal dynamics, if you've noticed any sort of common reasons why, or common blocks, I should say, to this honesty, just being a bit more honest in relationships.
Yeah, when somebody says, well, I'm going to be brutally honest, they're usually more brutal than honest.
Yeah.
When a person says, I'm going to be brutally honest, what they're likely to then do is to to go way over the net and share all the attributions they have made of the other. Well, I'm going to be brutally honest. The trouble is you're just self-centered. The trouble is you care only for yourself. The trouble is that you really don't love me, or you don't care about me. The trouble is you are an insecure person. Well, that isn't honest. Well, they are my stories. So I guess it's sort of honest as my stories, but I've stopped the notion it's my story. I've seen it as truth.
Mm.
And that's being brutal and isn't honest.
Mm.
So what we keep on doing in the course is when somebody starts to do that, we say, how are you feeling? And here I'm going to do a small digression because this is really important.
Mm.
In the English language, we use I feel in two very different ways. One is to express an emotion. I feel upset. I feel hurt. I feel sad. I feel excited. I feel close to you. I feel distant from you. But we also use I feel to express an opinion. And whenever you hear somebody say, I feel that, I feel like, I feel as, you're very unlikely to get an emotion. You're going to get an opinion. I feel that you want to dominate isn't a feeling. I feel scared because you do things which lead me to make up a story that you want to dominate.
Mm.
That's being honest. But what's most honest is I feel scared, and this is the behavior.
Mm.
And I could also add, here's my story, but the story isn't what's important. So the clue I would have is if you want to be more honest, can you share what's going on for you? Not share the story you're making up on the other. Now, the trouble is, if I'm bothered about your behavior, this is asking me to be even more open. So you've done something that hurts me. I want to raise my defenses. But it might be more effective for me to say, I really feel hurt by that comment.
Mm.
And you're going to say, well, I didn't mean to. I can say, yeah, I'm sure you didn't mean to, but that's how I felt. When you said that, I felt put down. That's being honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rather than saying you were just trying to hurt me, which would be in
Yes.
the opposing net.
Because I don't know. The this also works in organizations. In the book, we say the subtitle is "Building Exceptional Relationships with Family, Friends, and Colleagues." And what I say, because I also teach the leadership course, is I say people in organizations don't get up in the morning and say, I'm going to be impossible today. I'm going to be obnoxious. I'm going to try to sabotage everything. Nobody goes into there. It's back to the intentions.
Yeah.
And the trouble is we jump to conclusion, well, you just want to empire build. Well, I don't think anybody says I want to empire build. People may say, I want to stress the importance of my area. Well, don't all of us. But that's different. So again, I always start with the assumption until you prove opposite, I'm going to start with the assumption that you have good intentions. And I'm going to focus on the behavior that's bending me out of shape, that's annoying me, that's making me upset. That's what we have to deal with. And then maybe I can look at why I'm so upset, because others might not be. Yeah. But only I know the why. You don't know the why. And I'm sure that as a clinical psychologist, you've been struck the number of times your hunch has been wrong. But that you've seen that what's been most helpful is building conditions where I can explore myself at a greater depth than I would have otherwise. That's how you help me.
Yeah, absolutely. I've found that having an idea of my client too soon is like trying to uncomfortably contort them into some sort of prognosis. Yeah.
Yes.
And so, yeah, thank you so much, David, for all the wisdom, and the book is fantastic. I've been trying to consciously apply some of these things. The net analogy, for some reason, has stayed with me the most. So I've been most conscious about that. I just wanted to let you know about the impact on me.
That's what we want. If I can add and do a plug for the book, not only is what we've talked about handled in greater detail, but each of the chapters, at the end of each chapter, we have suggestions for how to use the material. So we just don't want people to understand the concepts. We want people to use it. And what we find is that we hear people say what you just said, that this has really been useful. I can apply it. And yes, it does work. Or it didn't quite work well enough, but I saw where it didn't, and I'm going to try again. So this is a book that we hope people look at again and again as they deal with the multitude of interpersonal issues that we all have.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to recommend anyone listening get a copy. I'm enjoying mine, and I'd just want to ask you where people can find out a bit more about you and the work you do. But before I do that, I just want to check in if there's any closing message that you would want people to get from this talk and from your work.
I think the closing point is to have all of us realize that everything we do is a choice. That may seem obvious, but often what we find in this course, and I find with clients that I coach, the people say, well, I can't do that. And we sort of are very firm about this. And we say, can't refers to a physical impossibility. I can't jump out of the third floor window and survive. But everything else is a choice. So somebody says, well, I can't raise this with my spouse. No, we say, I choose not to raise this with my spouse. Now, that may be a wise choice. But what I would hope the listener would realize is that all of our behavior is a choice, and to take responsibility for our choice. And again, we may not want to take the action, but to say, I choose not to take this action. The other small thing I would add is to add the word yet to it. I choose not to take this action yet because that always holds out the possibility that maybe next week conditions might change or I might change. It allows for much more growth, much more possibility. So I think that's what I would want the listener to end with, that we are active adults who make choices all the time. Own that.
I'm so glad I asked you that question, because you just changed, that just changing two words, choose and add in yet, it just totally reframed the situation. So I feel the impact of that, and yet again I'm excited to apply these things and see what the results are. So thank you so much for being generous with your time and being here and doing work that's really impactful for people, and being generous with that work. Where can people find out about you and the work you do?
You could look at our website, which is www.connect and relate, as if it's one word, no punctuation, connectandrelate.com. And you'll find some other podcasts, you'll find some articles, but you'll also find a self-assessment questionnaire that you might find useful. The other thing I want to say is that Random House, Penguin Random House, has just come out with a paperback version of the book. And I'm sure they distribute that in South Africa. And Amazon covers it, but I think your local bookstore can order it for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I'll drop some links below to the book for Amazon and the local publishers and everything. But yet again, David, I hope you have a good rest of the day, and I wish you all the best with the work you're doing.
Thank you. This has been very interesting, wonderful conversation, and good luck in what you're doing. It's really important.
Great. Thanks.